Thank you for joining us this evening. We'll be starting shortly. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're waiting for a few more people to sign on, and we'll be starting shortly.
Good evening. My name is Bart Hertzbach. I'm the chairperson of the Committee on Holocaust Education and Remembrance. This is a committee of the Jewish Community Relations Council of the Jewish Federation of Greater Philadelphia. The Jewish Community Relations Council, sometimes referred to as the JCRC, and our committee are dedicated to commemorating the Holocaust, honoring the memory of those who perished, and also promoting an understanding of the uniqueness and magnitude of the Holocaust, its consequences and critical lessons. We do this through a variety of programs throughout the year. They include the annual Holocaust Memorial Ceremony for the 6 million Jewish martyrs, the Dorothy Freeman Memorial Conversation with a Survivor, the Mordechai Anielewicz Creative Arts Competition, and the annual Youth Symposium on the Holocaust. At the end of this evening, we will tell you how to contact us for more information about all of our programs and activities. Tonight's program is brought to you by the Jewish Community Relations Council and co-sponsored by the following organizations: African American History Museum in Philadelphia, American Jewish Committee, AJC, Anti-Defamation League, ADL, ADL's Black Jewish Alliance, Council for Relationships, Delaware Valley Veterans Consortium, and Philadelphia Holocaust Remembrance Foundation. This program has a dual purpose: to commemorate the anniversary of Kristallnacht and to highlight the upcoming Veterans Day holiday. Kristallnacht, On the night of November 9th, 1938, violent anti-Jewish demonstrations broke out across Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia. Here's a partial description of what happened from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Over the next 48 hours, violent mobs, spurred on by anti-Semitic exhortations from Nazi officials, destroyed hundreds of synagogues, burning or desecrating Jewish religious artifacts along the way. Acting on orders from Gestapo headquarters, police officers and firefighters did nothing to prevent the destruction. All told, approximately 7,500 Jewish-owned businesses and homes and schools were plundered, and 91 Jews were murdered. An additional 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The Nazis came to call the event Kristallnacht, Crystal Night, or the Night of Broken Glass, referring to the thousands of shattered windows that littered the streets afterwards. But that euphemism does not convey the full brutality of the event. Kristallnacht was a turning point in the history of the Third Reich, marking the shift from anti-Semitic rhetoric and legislation to the violent aggression, anti-Jewish measures that would culminate with the Holocaust. Veterans Day, our national holiday honoring those who are currently serving or have served our country in the past, whether in times of war or peace, acknowledging the debt we owe for the sacrifices that these men, women, and their families make, sometimes, sadly, the ultimate sacrifice. If you Google Veterans Day, you'll find some moving quotes from everyday people to US presidents. Here are two of my favorites. We don't know them all, but we owe them all. Not a lot of words, but very deep and very meaningful. We don't know them all, but we owe them all. The second quote, we remember those who were called upon to give all a person can give. And we remember those who were prepared to make that sacrifice if it were demanded of them in the line of duty, though it never was. Most of all, we remember the devotion and gallantry with which all of them ennobled their nation as they became champions of a noble cause. So tonight, with deep gratitude, we salute all our veterans. And tonight's discussion with Ambassador John L. Withers II about his book, Balm in Gilead, A Story from the War, brings together these two threads, the Holocaust and military service, in a dramatic and moving way, in a way that clearly remains relevant and challenging even today. Among other things, the book addresses how we deal with differences, racial, religious, background, life experiences, just to name a few. And how do you summon the courage to let your basic humanity and decency guide you in the right direction, even when you face severe consequences for doing so? But before we hear Ambassador Withers' presentation, we will hear from Naomi Johansson, who won first place for 7th and 8th grade poetry as an 8th grader from Stetson Middle School in Westchester, Pennsylvania, and is now a 9th grader at Bayard Rustin High School. She will read her poem, I Remember. Naomi won first place while competing in the Mordechai Anielewicz Creative Arts Competition, a program of the Jewish Community Relations Council, which encourages all students in grades 7 through 12 throughout the greater Philadelphia area to learn about and respond to the Holocaust and the related issues of ethnic, racial, and religious intolerance by means of creative expression. An awards ceremony is held each spring in conjunction with an exhibition displaying the artistic submissions. So now here's first place winner, Naomi Johansson.
I remember. I remember the sounds of people laughing, kids playing, and families singing with joy. Now I hear moans of pain, cries for help, and grumbling from shrunken, starving stomachs. I remember when I wore silky red dresses and pink bows and shiny black heels. Now I wear faded blue and white striped pajamas with thick black numbers inked into my pallid skin. I remember when the birds sang a honey sweet song to the world. Now they croak bitter words of sorrow and farewell. I remember my mother's radiant smile and my little brother's simple, plump cheeks. Now all that is left are memories, painful in their joy. I hold on to them as my last bit of hope.
Thank you, Naomi. I think that sets a tone here. That's why you won first prize. It's easy to see. Ambassador Withers will engage with Elaine Culbertson to discuss his book. Elaine is chair of the Pennsylvania Holocaust Education Council, a statewide organization of teachers, survivors, and liberators who volunteer to keep the lessons of the Holocaust alive in the schools of the state. She's a member of the Pennsylvania Act 70 committee, named after the Pennsylvania Act regarding Holocaust education in the school. She is a convener of the Consortium of Holocaust Educators in the Philadelphia region. She serves as executive director of the American Gathering of Jewish Holocaust Survivors and Their Descendants, and has written chapters in 5 different books on Holocaust teaching methods, and has lectured across the United States. And I'm proud to say she's also a member of the Holocaust Education and Remembrance Committee of the Jewish Community Relations Council. And that is the abbreviated version of her bio at her request. Elaine, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bart. As a daughter of Holocaust survivors, I had a special interest in this book. Not much is written or talked about the end of the war and its aftermath. Everybody just assumes that life went back to normal. But what was normal? Either for the survivors or for the American soldiers that were stationed in Europe for sometimes 18 months, almost 2 years after the end of the war. How did a young Black lieutenant have the opportunity to shelter and nurture 2 young Jewish survivors? What were the circumstances? But my biggest question as I was reading this book is, why? Why was he doing this? I was aware of the inequalities that African Americans faced, not only in the United States, not only in the South, but also in the Army. How does someone who is experiencing prejudice, is the victim of prejudice, have the heart to help complete strangers, people foreign to him? We're going to hear John Withers' story about his father. We're going to hear how 2 boys were brought back to life by the nurturing of John Withers, and how his life was changed as well. Let me tell you a little bit about the author. John Withers was born in North Carolina. He spent much of his childhood with his parents who were in the Foreign Service. On returning to the United States, he earned a bachelor's from Harvard, a master's in East Asian Studies at McGill, and a PhD in the history of modern China from Yale. After joining the Foreign Service himself, he served in the Netherlands, in Nigeria, in Russia, just as communism fell, in Latvia, Slovenia, and as ambassador to Albania, as well as having domestic assignments as a special assistant to the Deputy Secretary of State and a director of the Operations Center. Now retired, John Withers and his wife, Mary Ruth, also a Foreign Service officer, live in Potomac, Maryland. John is going to tell his story, and then you will have the opportunity to ask questions along with me at the end of the presentation. Please put your questions into the chat. John, over to you.
We can hear you, John. We can hear you.
Okay, my image has not appeared on the screen.
We can see you and we can hear you. So please,
Okay, great.
thank you.
I want to start by thanking the Jewish Federation of Greater Philadelphia for this opportunity to speak with you and to share my father's story. It was very generous of them, and I'm deeply grateful. Before I begin with my remarks, I'd also like to say a couple of quick things. As has already been noted, tomorrow is the anniversary of Kristallnacht, this horrible outbreak of anti-Semitism in Germany. And I would simply like to say to those who suffered, who lost their homes, their businesses, their lives, let them never be forgotten. I would also like to say a quick word about our veterans, those people who defend us so loyally and so faithfully throughout the years. Let them always be remembered. I wish to tell you a story. It's a story that takes place in the milieu of great historical events: Jim Crow, the Second World War, the Holocaust. But it's primarily about the unlikely coming together of three young men and how their extraordinary friendship not only helps them negotiate the difficulties and the obstacles of the time, but also leads them, shows them a path, shows them principles that will remain with them and affect them for the rest of their lives. In the spring of 1945, a quartermaster truck company based in Germany got an emergency order to carry supplies to a German village with an unpronounceable name. The soldiers in this company paid very little attention to this order. They were not a famous group. They were like the hundreds of quartermaster truck companies in the American Army at the time. They had no combat role. They simply carried supplies from the great depots in the rear to the combat units at the front lines. They were supply troops and therefore not the glory soldiers like the airmen and the infantry and so on. They were anonymous. They had nothing to evoke anyone's particular attention. And like most of the quartermaster companies in World War II, because of racial segregation in the American military, they were virtually entirely Black. One white officer, the rest of them Black. The order itself, World War II had just ended, and these men were thinking not about any particular order. These orders were a dime a dozen during those times. And the fact that it was an emergency order didn't impress them one bit. All orders seemed to be of the nature of leave immediately and arrive even sooner. No, the men were thinking about going home. The war had ended, and they were thinking about going home. They were thinking about their mother's cooking. They were thinking about seeing their girlfriends again. They were thinking about their friends and their communities, and a return to the way of life that they had left in joining the army. And they were therefore shocked when this German village turned out to be the Dachau concentration camp. The camp had been liberated some weeks before, but conditions there nevertheless were horrid. And the men themselves were horrified. They had led tough lives. They were mainly from the South. They were sharecroppers. They'd seen much of the rough part of life, but they had never seen anything like Dachau. And my father, who was a lieutenant in the company, recalls that his men were quite upset by what they had seen. Many had nightmares, for example. The men were further shocked when a few days later, two young men, clearly those who had escaped Dachau, appeared at the entrance of their encampment. They still wore the striped jackets of the camp. They were in desperate condition, thin, covered with sores. And through the few words of English that they had and a great deal of sign language, they pleaded with the soldiers for anything that they could do to earn a bit, to help them on their way in the chaotic times of post-war Germany. Now, this presented the soldiers with quite a difficult decision. Army regulations were particularly strict concerning displaced persons, as these two young men would be called at the time. The Army was afraid of the morale effects of having such people who had endured such suffering when they encountered soldiers, if they were together with soldiers, but they were particularly frightened of the infectious diseases that were rife in these camps. And they feared that if an army unit, and particularly a quartermaster unit, traveling all around as they did, if they became infected, they could infect a greater part of the army. So the rules were laid down that there was not to be that kind of contact with displaced persons. And the punishments for disobeying those rules were very strict. Dishonorable discharge, perhaps under certain conditions, court-martial. And what we have to understand is that those punishments had greater implications. These men grew up in the South in the Jim Crow era. And that kind of black mark on their records would have put them in a very difficult position once they returned home. It would be difficult to get jobs. It would be difficult to hold your head up in the community. And so this was not a light decision that could be easily made. And all of this was based upon the fact that they came from, for the most part, a social, political, legal, psychological regime, segregation, that was designed to lock African Americans into a condition of inferiority in every sphere of their lives. And remember also that there was no recourse. Segregation, Jim Crow, was not an aberration. It was the law of the land reinforced by major decisions of the United States Supreme Court. Now, one element of segregation, I think too often we see portrayals of segregation that reduce it to what amount to kind of personal slights. You can't drink at that water fountain, only that. You have to move to the back of the bus. These were examples of, on a small level, of this much greater and more repressive system. And one of the key elements of that repression was the lack of opportunity. I can illustrate that through a quick discussion of my father's life and his upbringing. He was 28 years old at that moment in 1945. 25 of those years had been lived in his hometown of Greensboro, North Carolina. It was his known world. He knew of nothing else. But as a young man, hoping to make something of himself, he found himself thwarted in every way that he tried to improve himself. His father was a janitor. His mother was a seamstress. They had to patch together a livelihood for their four children. The facilities that Black Americans were allowed to use were simply substandard. The schools, the universities, the housing, all of a lesser standard than was available to the white portion of the population. An example of that, my father was a studious young man, loved to read, but his primary source of books was something called the Carnegie Negro Library. These were libraries established by the Carnegie family for the use of what at the time were called Negroes. And it was a very well-intentioned attempt to provide facilities and some degree of educational opportunity to the African Americans. The Carnegie Negro Library in Greensboro was tiny. It is still there. It is part of the Bennett College campus, and anyone visiting it will be struck by just how small it is. And at the time of its opening, there were only a little over 100 books on its shelves. Over time, it grew. Over time, it grew to several thousands of books, most of them cast-offs from the Greensboro Public Library, open only to whites. And with this, he was expected to compete as best he could to try to gain such advantages that he might encounter. But with very, very little chance of making his way the way that other residents of Greensboro might do. He escaped only once under a very peculiar provision of North Carolina law designed to prevent pressure to have African American students attend the North Carolina universities and graduate schools. The state provided money for tuition, for living expenses, for transportation, for any African American student who is accepted in a recognized graduate institution as long as it was outside the state of North Carolina. My father was able to use that to go to the University of Wisconsin, There, he earned a master's degree in economics, which was an accomplishment for a young African-American at the time. One of his professors was Milton Friedman, who later on went to win the Nobel Prize in economics. With that master's degree, my father looked forward to living in the North, away from this repressive system of Jim Crow in the South, finding a job, a teacher, something, but escaping segregation forever. However, the US government had different plans for him. The war had broken out. My father, by the way, was very, very supportive of the war effort and of the fight against Nazi racism. But the war had broken out and he was drafted, and therefore thrust yet again into segregation. At the end of the war, looking for future possibilities, he came across the GI Bill. And he thought this might be yet another door opening to something better for himself. But he saw it also as his last chance. If he could not qualify, if something happened, he was resigned to returning to Greensboro and living out his life there. And it was at this moment that he and his men confronted the decision about what to do with these two young Jewish Holocaust survivors. I have described the situation of African Americans in terms of the various types of impoverishment that was forced upon them. But there was one respect in which they were not impoverished. They were not morally impoverished. And what they did showed that. Because the men, sympathetic with young men who had gone through what they had seen at Dachau, brought them into the camp. The camp became a haven for these young men. They gave them work in the kitchen. Later on, and they taught them to be mechanics. At one point, they trusted them so much that they put one of the young men on guard duty with a gun. And over the next year, these two young men became part of this African-American truck company. They bonded very closely with the Black soldiers. The soldiers gave them uniforms. They paid them for their work. And mainly, they supported them in their efforts to do well by the jobs that they had been given. And these young men responded very, very positively to that type of positive reinforcement. When the convoys moved along the roads to different stations, the young men came with them. Now, this involved a certain amount of risk. On the roads were policed by the military police, all white units, who seemed to take a kind of delight in irritating the all Black truckers. They were constantly demanding paperwork. They were constantly hassling them for this, that, and the other. One part of it, of course, was that they knew that the truckers had good supplies. And often the truckers would give them the good cigarettes or the coffee or the chocolate, the silk stockings or whatever they had, just to get these guys to leave them alone. In one case, the military police almost discovered one of the young men. The truck cargo bay happened to be empty. And as the police went to check it, the young man didn't know what to do, but a quick thinking soldier grabbed a tarpaulin, threw it over the young man who lay on the floor and sat on it. And when the police looked in, there's just a Black soldier sitting there whittling on a twig, and they left him alone. Years and years later, 50 years later, that particular young man remembers that incident And his reaction to it was that soldier needed to go on a diet. He was very heavy. That comradeship lasted about a year. And of course, it involved adjustments. The Black soldiers had never encountered these young men. It turned out they were from Poland. And it started with the names. They just simply did not know how to pronounce the Polish names of these young men. The younger one, who was about 16, was named Mieczysław Weichensperr. A soldier saw the written version of that and said to my dad, "Lieutenant, isn't he lacking a few vowels in his name?" The slow tongues of Alabama and Mississippi just could not curl around that. So they gave the two young men nicknames. The older boy, who was around 18 or 19, was called Solomon. It more or less resembled his actual name. The younger one, Mieczysław, they gave up. They just called him Pee-wee, the old Southern nickname. So Solomon and Pee-wee, the two latest recruits to the to my father's company. They also, the young men also had some adjusting to do. There were many things about the African-American soldiers that struck them as quite unique and puzzling, not threatening, but just not quite understandable. For example, baseball. The young men saw no point in a sport in which you hit a round ball with a cylindrical stick and ran around in circles. Nor did they understand certain of the customs. At night, many of the men would pomade their hair and then press them into cut pieces of stocking to keep that hair intact and stylish as it was in the times. They didn't understand that. So gradually, they began to undertake a little ritual, which over time grew and grew. They approached my father. He was older, he was more mature than the others. And so they would go to him and very shyly ask him, what was this all about? And they would sit there in the aftermath of the workday, and my father would explain the different things. He would, they gradually began to turn these sessions into just kind of end of the day discussion sessions. They'd sing little songs, tell jokes, report on the day's doings, and this became just part of the everyday regime of these three young men. Now, my father was not a psychiatrist, and he was not more equipped or more sensitive or anything to deal with what he knew, what he understood must be the traumatic experiences that these two boys had gone through. But he couldn't get at them. They simply refused to talk about the past. They wouldn't talk about their families. They wouldn't talk about their hometowns. They wouldn't talk about anything that had happened during this Holocaust era. And any attempt by my dad or his men to raise questions about this would lead to the boys getting very emotional. So the unspoken rule was, don't talk about it. But in these talks with my father, he began to notice things. He began to notice that the boys' interest circulated more and more and more around America. They were constantly asking about America. And it soon struck him that they didn't see America as it really was. They saw America in some kind of idealized way. And he began to understand that they were, in their questions to him, they were really asking him, is this a place that perhaps we can go? Is this a place where perhaps we might find a new beginning? And it slowly dawned on him that what these boys were really seeking from him were reasons to believe, reasons to be reassured that this thing called life, which had been so terrible to them up until that moment, was worth pursuing. And my father realized that it was to him that they had turned to grasp what might lay before them and what they could do about it. His responsibility was to relay to them that no matter how horrid their past had been, the future yet held hope. So he didn't speak about the America of his experience. He knew the kids didn't need negativism in any form. He spoke of America the ideal, the America that he himself dreamed of, the America that one day would come, the America, to borrow Dr. King's phrase, that one day would live out the true meaning of its creed of equality and justice. Eventually, it became clear to everyone that the unit was about to leave. It would be demobilized. The men would return to their families in the United States. By that time, they had been almost a year with the company, and they had grown both physically, mentally, psychologically. And they were confident enough now to begin seeking a new phase of their lives in the German towns that were around. And they ended up getting jobs at a mechanic station in the city of Bamberg. They rented their own apartments. The older boy, Solomon, met a young Jewish Holocaust survivor named Paula, also from Poland. They got engaged. Eventually they wedded. And when my father therefore left, they were on their feet again. They bade each other goodbye. They gave each other mementos, and then they left. And my father believed that he would quite possibly never see these young friends again. Let's jump forward 10 years. My father returned to the United States. He earned the GI Bill. He successfully pursued his PhD from the University of Chicago, where, by the way, Milton Friedman had transferred. He met a very pretty young woman from High Point, North Carolina. They married. Some years later, I came along. A couple of years after that, my brother. And they, in seeking opportunities for a livelihood, they hit upon the Foreign Service of the United States. And so we moved abroad. Now, in moving abroad, we encountered something that would later on have consequences for this story. Our first posting, many of our postings, but our first one was Vientiane, Laos in 1958. It was very poor. There was no citywide water or sewer system. We collected our water in a cistern and had to chlorinate, boil, and so on to make it drinkable. There was no television. Radios were simply propaganda stations from the Cold War era. And so entertainment in those postings often and largely revolved around telling stories. There would be whole parties which people gathered, the men and the women, just simply to tell stories. But on the rainy monsoon nights, when the electricity had gone out and we were simply sitting around, my dad would tell us stories. We liked, at that age, I was 9 or 10, my brother 7 or 8, we loved his war stories. Of course, we had very much an Audie Murphy or a John Wayne view of the war stories. We thought our dad had single-handedly won the war. We liked the adventure stories, the time the convoy got strafed and so on. But the story that he always told was one that in our youth we didn't understand. It was the story of these two young men. And he came back to it and came back to it and came back to it. We didn't understand it at that time, but as we grew, slowly, its significance came to us. Let's shift forward another close to 40 years. My father had retired from the Foreign Service and he became ill. He came down with cancer and his personality changed. He was not the outgoing, gregarious people person that we had all known and had grown accustomed to. He looked inward. He was withdrawn. And my mother surmised that he was going through a phase that elderly men sometimes go through of trying to sum up his life, to determine now that he felt that he couldn't adjust it very much, that that had he actually led a good life, had he been a good person. And of course, we all told each other, of course he had. Let's march in and tell him. But my mother said, no, you can't. You have to show him. And somehow in all of that, I began my search for the men of his company. I began to try to seek the historicity of this story that clearly had meant so much to him. And I began to look for the men in his company, and finally for the two young Jewish men. Now, all I had to begin my search was one postcard. I don't know if you can see this. All right, this is the boy called Pee Wee in his military uniform. And on the back, he had his name and his address, and he had a date. And I began with that. The other boy had simply been called Solomon. I didn't know if it was last name or first name. I couldn't search for him. And I began a search that was to take me a great many years. I won't take you through all of the dead ends. I won't take you through all of the disappointments that I suffered. The records that I needed that had been destroyed in the fire, the records that no longer existed in the camps that I believed that they had been in, on and on and on and on and on. But through just a series of amazing coincidences, I found a professor from North Carolina who was studying the camp in the hometown of Pee Wee. And he put out a little blurb that says that study was based upon interviews with survivors. I contacted him and asked him if Mieczysław Weichensberg was one of the people he had talked to. No, he said. But there's a man in Toronto, a wonderful man named Howard Chandler, who has devoted his life to keeping the Holocaust memories alive and has had great connections with the survivors from this hometown. I contacted Chandler. He is indeed a wonderful man. And he helped me through all of this. It turned out that, yes, he was a boyhood friend of Mieczysław's. Yes, they had been in many of the same camps together. And lo and behold, after the war, at a reunion of the survivors, he had met Mieczyslaw again. I asked him if he had any contact information at all, and he gave me a phone number. And immediately I sat down and I called the number. To my great disappointment, indeed probably the only moment in this whole search that I actually despaired, the number replied with a just recorded message that it was no longer in service. And after all of this searching and the psychological impact of looking so hard and so long, I leapt to the conclusion that I'd probably missed him. He'd probably passed away before I could reach him. But I called Chandler again and he encouraged me. No, keep looking. I'll help you. We will do everything we can to find Mieczyslaw. And Chandler was as good as his word. A few days after that interaction, the phone in my little office rang. And a woman's voice came over the phone. She said, "My name is Barbara Berggren." The name meant nothing to me. I thought she had the wrong number. She said, "A Mr. Chandler has called us and asked and told us that you might be looking for a relative of mine." Again, the psychology. I thought, oh no, if she's calling, it's because he can't. No, said Barbara, no. He's my father and he's sitting right here. But he has a bit of a hearing problem and I only wanted your permission to stay on the line to help with communication. And then at that moment, a voice that I'd always imagined, soft, slightly accented, came on the line. And the man said, "Did you say your name was John Withers?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you related to Lieutenant John L. Withers of Greensboro, North Carolina?" I said, "Yes, he's my father." "How is your father?" "He's fine. I saw him this morning." "Well, you tell him," said this man, who I later learned was Pee Wee, "you tell him that I'm fine too." 3 weeks later, we held a reunion. Pee Wee had been living in Connecticut. He had come to America after all. And we all got together for one of the most incredible weekends of my life. We met his wonderful family, his son, his daughter, his grandkids. Marvelous people. And there he was able to begin to tell the story that for so long he had never been able to bring himself to tell of his past history. And we learned about the terrible camps he had been in. We learned of the destruction of his hometown. We learned of the destruction of his family, including the terrible day in October 1942, in which at the selection in his hometown, his mother and his younger sister were marched out of the market square to trains that would take them to Treblinka. And as Pee Wee later told me, nobody ever came back from Treblinka. Through Pee Wee, I was also able to learn about Solomon. His name was Shlomo Yaskowitz. And after the war, he had traveled to Israel. And through them and through the aid of one of my other dear friends, a Foreign Service colleague named Debbie Schwartz, who was stationed in Israel at the time, I was able to locate Solomon. Unfortunately, his widow, Solomon, had died earlier, and his two daughters. But they told me that after all of those years, Solomon always spoke to them about the colored soldier with the golden heart, who had taught Solomon once again to believe in the beautiful side of life. She sent me a letter, and at the back of the letter was a Xerox copy of a small picture which he said Solomon had carried with him in his wallet until the day he passed away. It was a picture of my father, and on the back was inscribed, "To my dear friend Solomon, John L. Withers." A few years later, I must say one thing that I must say about that reunion before I move on. The most amazing thing about it was that 55 years after the liberation of Dachau, these two men picked up a friendship as though not a day had passed. It was one of the most remarkable, incredible things that I had ever seen. A few years later, Pee Wee died. He was buried in Connecticut. We all went to his memorial service. That service typically was attended by people from all over the world: Cambodians, Jamaicans, African Americans, Jews, Catholics, everyone together to pay homage to this incredible, incredible man. At a certain point in the memorial testaments, my father stood up. He walked to the podium. He looked around and he said, "My name is John Withers, and I have known this man longer than anyone in the room. And let me tell you the kind of man that he was." 4 years later, my father too passed away. But I'd never seen the doubts. I had never seen the inward turning that I'd witnessed earlier after he had met Pee Wee and discovered what had happened to Solomon. He was, for those last years, himself again. One day, he was sitting on the back porch with my mother. He was reading. She was sewing a blouse. And suddenly he put the book aside, looked up, and said, apropos nothing, "I have achieved everything I wanted in my life." He died a week later. When he did, at the ceremony commemorating his life, we sang, his niece, who was a soprano at the Met, sang his favorite spiritual, "There is a balm in Gilead," a slave song, but a song that he always felt connoted hope. As I went through all of this, I had many questions. And the one question, I suppose, above them all that emerged from this was, what is the measure of a human being? Is it wealth? Is it fame? Is it power? Or is it something quieter, humbler, simpler? Some attribute that we carry in ourselves that we can use to make ourselves better. Solomon, Pee Wee, and Lieutenant Withers were different in so many ways: race, creed, cultural experiences. But they had one attribute in common. And that attribute was the ability not only to look into another human's face and see the humanity there, but to feel that humanity therefore radiating from within themselves in the form of compassion and understanding. I won't tell you what conclusion or what moral to draw from this story. It's a human story on a human level, and I believe each of you should be free to interpret it in its own way. All that I can say is that I take hope from the fact that Solomon, Pee Wee, and Lieutenant Withers were once among us, and from my belief that others like them are with us still. Thank you so much for listening to me. I understand that there may be a photo or two that I can discuss, and then I'm open to any questions you might have. This is my father, and a young German kid named Hans. He's appropriated my father's combat helmet and his belt and his jacket. And from what I understand from my dad's memory, pretty soon you couldn't tell Hans from the commanding officer of the company. These are pictures of the two young men. On the left is Solomon, about 1945. And if you look, you see that he's still wearing his camp jacket, even though it appears that he's in army boots and maybe pants, and his hair still cropped short, and his look speaks for itself. On the right is Pee Wee. Look at the contrast between them. This is Pee Wee right at the end of his time with the soldiers, dressed in his army uniform, fully recovered, vibrant, as pictures of Solomon at that time would also be. This is perhaps my favorite picture. On the left is Solomon. Above them, looking through the window, is a soldier that we can only identify by the name Dave. And on the right is Pee Wee. And I think if you look long enough at this picture, you see in it really the underlying theme of the story I've tried to present. This is the reunion in April of 2001. In the center, you see my father in the large glasses. And to his left in the picture is Mieczysław Eichenberg, who took the American name of Martin Wigan and who was once known as Pee Wee. His wife is on the right, his grandchildren, his son is on the far left. Barbara is in the orange blouse. My own wife and I are there. My mother is standing to my right as you stare at the picture. Brings back wonderful memories. So,
John, can you see me and hear me?
I can.
Okay, I'm having a little bit of a computer issue and I'm now on my iPad instead of on my on my desktop. So forgive me for this. I hope everybody can hear me. You've spoken so eloquently and so beautifully about this experience. And you touched a little bit on what it was like for you to hear these stories. What actually was the motivation to write the book? Because you had already done for your father what your mother had asked. You had already made him tell the story and measure his life in a way that he was satisfied. What motivated you to write about it?
Well, Elaine, at the beginning of this presentation, you said that you had a central question.
Mm-hmm.
That question was why?
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose that was the starting point. Why did these men, why did my father do what he did? Could I pin that down in some kind of way? Could I elucidate it? Could I make more sense of it? And so, you know, initially I thought it might be pretty straightforward. But as I dug into it, it was not straightforward at all. And the more that I dug into it, the broader the project became. And it suddenly occurred to me that I could not really explain why, but perhaps I could set the environment, both of the young men and of the men in my dad's company and my dad, set the circumstances and the environment that informed the decision to take the actions that they took. And that's why I won't really answer the question, why. I can come to the edge of it. But there's something kind of beyond words that made them take that last step. And I leave that to people to try to make a determination, perhaps to be more successful than I've been.
So how does it relate to what is going on today in our world, in our society, in the United States?
I still believe that human interaction with compassion, with understanding, is our way forward. And I believe that this story, in its on its very, very human level, encapsulates that we don't need to be a political figure. We don't need to be a corporate executive. We don't need to be any of that. We, as our own individual human beings, can reach out as they did, and in so doing, maybe move things forward a little bit. But let me say one more thing, a bit beyond, a little bit beyond the immediate scope of your question. I believe in a human, personal way that there's a theme, a larger theme for us. I am quite distraught in recent times to read about tensions that have grown between the African American and the Jewish communities. From my perspective, the alliance between Black Americans and Jews has been one of the most powerful alliances for social justice that there is. And I look back all the way to the slave era, in which the slaves identified through their knowledge of the Bible with the Hebrews of old, with the Hebrews' quest for freedom. And I'm always struck by the fact that the songs or the poems or the expressions of the slaves in that time reference the wisdom of the ancient Jewish people. So for example, one of the great spirituals is really Passover. When Israel was in Egypt's land, let my people go. It's Passover. And the verse that I use as the title of my book, A Balm in Gilead, it's from Jeremiah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when my father, when the phrase first struck him, it first struck him when he was in Dachau and he witnessed the horrors there. And when he glanced at it, he saw that what it said was, "Is there a balm in Gilead?" for the terrors that he had seen. And he took it almost as a cry of despair. Is there a balm in Gilead? But all those years later, when he developed this liking for the slave song, it was reversed. The song is, "There is a balm in Gilead." And he took that as a sign of hope. I cannot emphasize this enough. If you'll just permit me, Jewish lawyers defended the Scottsboro Boys in that notorious case back in the 1930s. Andrew Goodman, all right, and Michael Schwerner.
Schwerner, yes.
And James Chaney died together in the cause of social justice in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Rabbi Heschel marched with Dr. King from Selma. This alliance has really been invaluable to everyone. And I would like to beg your indulgence and read something that Dr. King wrote back in 1958 that showed that his view of this bond between Blacks and Jews had ramifications beyond just the immediate ones that I can come up with. Let me just quote him. This was to the American Jewish Committee in 1958, and Dr. King said, "My people were brought to America in chains. Your people were driven here to escape the chains fashioned for them in Europe. Our unity is born of our common struggle for centuries, not only to rid ourselves of bondage, but to make the oppression of any people by others an impossibility." He had a real vision for us, and I think it is important to maintain that vision.
That is so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with us. There's one thing that you said and that I also read in the book that really struck me, that your father wanted Pee Wee and Solomon to hear about the America as it might be, and not the America that was, and that he worked very hard in his conversations with them to kind of elevate what the American dream was, even though he was not experiencing it himself. Can you comment a little bit on that?
You know, it's an interesting thing, and that is that even from the depths of slavery, African Americans have held a belief in a just universe, that even though they were not at that moment doing well, that they were in bondage, that they were maltreated, they believed that a better day is going to come. They believed that somewhere there would be a time when we would all be equal and live in friendship, and so on. And that, and it's interesting that belief is still very, very much a part of African Americans today, even facing continued travails. Again, Dr. King said it. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And he also said, we must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. And,
Beautifully
and
said.
this was what I think informed my father. He was not lying to these young men. He actually believed in that America to come. He lived a great, a rich, a full life. I only wish that he had lived a little longer to see Barack Obama elected president.
Well, John, you know I have about 300 questions for you. And I'm getting a signal from Beth that I need to curb my questions and we need to move on with the program. So I'm going to cede my time, much as I would like to ask so much more and have people have the opportunity to ask so much more. I don't think we can stay on any longer with this section. So
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Withers. My name is Arlene Fickler, and I am the chair of the Jewish Community Relations Council of the Jewish Federation of Greater Philadelphia. Jason, are you hearing me? Looks like I've got a...
We hear you.
Okay, fine, thank you. Ambassador Withers, thank you so very, very much for bringing to us this evening your father's story, a story of compassion, of bravery, and of humanity. I can't imagine a more fitting program to present in commemoration of both Kristallnacht and Veterans Day, particularly in this year 2020, when so many of us are struggling to identify ways in which we can help to realize the American dream as your father saw it, and as our parents and all our parents and grandparents saw it, a dream that we hope will soon become a reality. As I said, my name is Arlene Fickler, and it's my honor to chair the Jewish Community Relations Council of the Jewish Federation of Greater Philadelphia. The JCRC is an organization dedicated, among other things, to fighting bigotry, to building relationships between the Jewish community and other communities of faith and color in Philadelphia, and to remembering and teaching the Holocaust, not only because of its importance to Jewish history, but because of its lessons for overcoming racism and anti-Semitism in our city and in our country. Ambassador Withers, your father's story is one that we're particularly pleased to be able to share with our listeners this evening, because it embodies the values that our JCRC holds so dear and works every day to realize the fulfillment of that American dream. I want to again thank each of the organizations that are the sponsors of this event. Philadelphia's African American History Museum, the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League and its Black Jewish Alliance, the Council for Relationships, the Delaware Valley Veterans Consortium, and Philadelphia's Holocaust Remembrance Foundation. We thank each of those organizations for partnering with us on this program. And we look forward to working with each of them to build stronger relationships between Philadelphia's Jewish and Black communities, and to together fighting all forms of bigotry in our city and in our country. As I said, and as Bart said, Holocaust education and remembrance is an important part of the JCRC's agenda. On the screen, you will see a list of our Holocaust-related programs, including our annual memorial ceremony for the 6 million martyrs of the Holocaust, and our Mordechai Anielewicz Creative Arts Competition, which Bart told you about earlier. You can get more information about all of our programs on the Holocaust Education Resources page of the Jewish Federation. That's jewishphilly.org/Holocaust. And included among the things that you will find there are the works of all of our poetry winners and more in the 2020 Mordechai Anielewicz competition booklet. You've already heard from one of this year's winners. And to close this evening, I am very glad to welcome another of the winners of the 2020 Mordechai Anielewicz competition, Ivy Chang. Ivy won first, second, and third place for the 11th and 12th grade poetry competition in the spring of 2020, when she was a senior at Downingtown East High School. She's now studying at the University of Pittsburgh. She will share with us this evening her winning poem, A World That's Broken. Ivy, Mazel Tov, congratulations on being a winner in this year's poetry competition, and thank you for sharing your poetry with us this evening.
Great, thank you so much, Arlene, for having me here tonight. I'm going to be reading A World That's Broken. It doesn't take darkness to recognize beauty. I used to come home from work and find simple pleasures in the quality of the weather, the warmth of a hot cup of coffee, the smile of my wife. It didn't take her death for me to recognize her beauty, and it didn't take the grueling work of a concentration camp to prove me the leisure of my old job. When the light used to filter awkwardly through the wire of the fence, I had not the energy nor the freedom to admire its beauty. In the midst of my digging, in the face of a firing squad. When the birds sung their melodies in the days in which they did not avoid the smokestacks of the camp, the disorienting blur of exhaustion mutilated their tune to an untranslatable commotion. When a crumb of bread appeared amongst the transparent soup, I had not the strength to digest nor the hunger to ingest such a rare luxury. I have not a revolutionary appreciation of the beauty of the world that is not a product of oppression, but a sympathy for fragility of a world that's broken. Thank you.
You're muted, Arlene.
Thank you again, Ivy. Thank you, Ambassador Withers. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Good night.